Right, so the video today that we're going to talk about is the history of the Land Rover in the Australian Army. And this is actually really interesting. This is part of our Origin series, and in the Origin series we're looking at origins of pieces of technology that we use as adventurers to get out there and see the wonderful world we live in. And one of the key pieces of technology that has impacted here in Australia is the Land Rover. Now, the Land Rover had a great impact, particularly in the late 50s and early 60s, and this was actually with the Series 2 and the 2A. But with the Australian Army, it actually went back a lot earlier than that. After World War II, we were left with a fleet of American-built Jeeps. Now, by the mid-50s, these were starting to get rather tired, and even earlier than that, the early 50s. And the Australian government started looking around for a vehicle that could potentially replace them. A number of the Series 1 80-inch were actually tested, and some of which did actually enter service with the Australian Army. But it wasn't until 1958, when wartime Jeeps were really starting to look quite tired, that it was decided that there was going to need to be a replacement that would replace the whole fleet. So they did some trials. They used the Austin Gypsy, they used the CJ3 Jeep, and they used the Land Rover 88-inch Series 2. Now, cut a long story short, they ended up deciding on going for the Land Rover Series 2 88-inch, and these were pressed into service in 1959. Now, this one here is undergoing restoration, but this is in fact one of the ones that was pressed into service in 1959. And they were used primarily as a reconnaissance vehicle, the 88-inch. Now, when I'm talking about the 88-inch, I'm talking about a short wheelbase. So that's slightly longer than your average four-wheel drive. So this is one of the short wheelbase variances that they had. This saw service from 1959 up until 1980. They did a few different alterations to them. They were fitted with a 106mm recoilless anti-tank gun at the back. These particular variations were fitted with more heavy-duty shocks at the front and heavy-duty springs due to the actual recoil of the gun. They were later fitted with the Javelin anti-tank missile in the 2A variants that came out, and they were also fitted with the M2 Browning in the 1970s when our APCs were actually undergoing upgrades. So they were used as a training vehicle. And if you're not aware, the M2 Browning is a 2.9mm 50 caliber rifle machine gun, and this was actually bolted onto the dashboard on the passenger side. It's pretty interesting. You can't really do that with a plastic dashboard, but anyway. But very interesting bit of kit. This one being a Series 2, it does differ to the Series 2A, and I won't go in depth in this video about that because we're talking primarily about the military history here. As I said before, they did later on come out with some variations to it, but this one here in particular was virtually completely, utterly bulk standard. Apart from having a slightly different paint job on it to obviously cover up the galvanise, it was pretty much what you got off the showroom floor. Now, later on, with the ensuing conflict in Vietnam, that obviously bogged down a lot of our forces for a number of years, we had to obviously make a bigger presence. So therefore we needed vehicles that were a lot more specialised. And this came into the Land Rover Series 2A, which we've actually got here. Now, the impressive thing before I go on about this vehicle and what I've talked about with the Land Rover Series 2 is the impressive military service that they actually had. The short wheelbase that I was talking about just then, in the 2A version, remained in service up until 1985 with a recoilless 106mm anti-tank gun. They even went on further than that, and many of the specialised vehicles remained in service well and truly up until the late 1990s. The 2A differs considerably in the military spec here in Australia compared to its predecessor, the Series 2. One of the key things that you've probably noticed is the guards are rather odd. They've actually been cut out. Now, the reason why these guards have been cut out is actually due to early trials that were conducted in Canberra, the capital of Australia. And in that part of the world, it's actually got a lot of black clay. They found with these trials that the wheels were actually becoming clogged up with the clay, so much so that they were actually filling up the guards. There was no way for the actual mud to escape. And that's why they decided that one of the military specs that they would actually have is actually cutting out the guards. Now later on, when the Series 3 came into service in the mid-70s, they actually dropped this because they found that it was a pretty specialised case that actually occurred. So they actually dropped that and they went back to the standard guards. As I've said, these vehicles were a lot more modified. These came out with a 2.5-inch lift in it, I believe. They came out with heavy-duty axles in the rear. They came out with a blackout light system, so that meant you would simply turn a key, your headlights, your indicators, your park lights would all go off. And a little lamp at the front and the rear of the vehicle would actually light up. The lamp at the back would then shine onto your diff, the pumpkin of the actual diff, which is white, painted white, and the vehicle behind you would actually follow you virtually half a car length behind. Now the reason for this was that it's harder to spot you at night via enemy aircraft. So this was obviously very much more so for the reconnaissance and also probably more for the cargo side of things. One of the other key features that these came out with was dual fuel tanks. It was found very early on that the standard 10-gallon fuel tank simply wasn't enough. Over here we've got such a vast country, 40 litres really doesn't get you far. You're looking probably at about 200 kilometres if you're lucky with a fully loaded vehicle. And this one here, being an FFR, was very much a fully loaded vehicle. And they came out in a number of different variations, which I've kind of already touched on. So they came out in a PC, a personnel carrier. They came out in FFR and FFT, so fitted for radio and fitted for transmission. They also came out in reconnaissance variants, and they also came out in a tracked variants too, which these are actually a really impressive bit of kit, which we'll put a video up sometime and give you a bit more of an in-depth rundown of the actual variant there. But a really impressive bit of kit. And they really have stood the test of time. As I said, these were in service right up until the 1980s and beyond. Particularly with the South African Army, they invested heavily in their Series 2As. And during the 1980s went through a really rigorous rebuilding program and actually went through the whole vehicles. I haven't got any consistent reports, but I would imagine if you're going through and rebuilding a whole fleet, you're hoping that you'll get at least another 10 to 15 years. So I wouldn't be surprised if these were still in service well up into the millennium in South Africa. Certainly you can see it with a lot of their other equipment, such as the Centurion tank, which they ended up, I think, reboring out and actually keeping that in service a bit longer too. So they really have stood the test of time. And if you are looking for a Land Rover out there and you really want a Land Rover with a bit of history, you really can't go past one of these. Anyway, we'll give you a run through of the inside of the vehicle. So this is inside the 109-inch FFR Australian Army Land Rover specs. So as you can see here, the dashboard configuration is very different to your standard Land Rover Series 2A. This little button here isn't actually a button, that's your map light. And by turning this, simply rotating it, I can turn it from a spread beam to a spot beam. So it's very handy at night when you're doing night ops. The other thing that we've got here too is your temperature gauge and oil pressure gauge, which are amalgamated into one unit. So the blackout switch is over here. So I can simply twist that and then all the lights will shut off on the vehicle. The ignition barrel is also different too, and this actually has an interesting bit of history behind it. With the Willys Jeep, they actually all came out with ignition keys. But one of the problems that they found was that when they actually had to get out and go on drills, they couldn't find any of the keys. They'd all gone missing. So what they ended up doing was actually gluing the keys inside the ignition barrels. Anyway, Land Rover answered that and took on that experience and actually fitted in a NATO spec ignition barrel. So to actually turn on the vehicle, there's a little on switch here, which I just switch on, and I've got power. And then I simply press the ignition button below here, and then the engine will start. Now this one here has obviously been fitted with a few optional extras later on after its service in the Australian Army. It's been fitted with a Smith's heater here, which it didn't come out with. That was an optional extra. Another thing too is also the passenger side windscreen wiper motor, which was also optional extra too, so it wouldn't have been fitted with that also. But it is a really interesting vehicle. You've got plates here, there and everywhere, going back to its actual history. Here's one of the NATO plates here, and also its NATO number. As Australia is a part of NATO, and obviously being a part of the Commonwealth too, we obviously have to comply to it. So you can use that to actually look into the history of the vehicle, what units it's been involved with, and then you can actually figure out where it's actually served in its history. Like the Land Rover Series 3 that we've been through on prior videos, our Expedition Spec Land Rover Series 3, we've got a little brass tap down here, and that flicks over from the right hand tank to the left hand tank. It uses one gauge for both tanks for the sender units, and you simply have a little switch here where you flick to the left to the right. This vehicle, as I said, is a FFR, so fitted for radio. So I think it's 800 amp DC generator or 80 amp DC generator, correct me if I'm wrong. That's actually fitted underneath the bonnet, and then that would go back and charge the lead acid batteries that were actually kept in the back. It then had a radio aerial that actually fitted to the front wings at the front, and then with that the radios were then actually fitted in the back on a wooden desk, and the radio operator would sit in the back. One of the other variations that this vehicle had was a 24 blade fan that actually fitted straight onto the water pump. Now the reason for that was that these vehicles would sit for hours and hours on end, and if you're imagining that they're in Central Australia or they're in Southeast Asia, where you're looking at 40 degrees centigrade, so that's above 100 degrees Fahrenheit with 80% humidity, they're going to overheat pretty quickly. So they did that to try and help out the cooling system. So as I've said, fascinating bit of kit, and keep an eye out for these vehicles, and think about this video when you see your next one driving down the road. Anyway, I'll catch you later on.